I never thought I'd have to barricade my own property just to protect what was legally mine. But when I saw those expensive SUVs and luxury sedans lined up on my private road like it was some kind of exclusive country club parking lot, something inside me snapped. The look on Karen Whitfield's face when she realized all 23 vehicles belonging to her precious HOA members were completely stranded behind my newly installed gate. Priceless. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how the Oakwood Estates HOA tried to steal my family's private road and how their own entitlement became the perfect trap. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My grandfather built Hillcrest Estate with his bare hands back in the 1960s. 3 acres of wooded paradise on the outskirts of Pine Ridge, complete with a winding half-mile private road that connected our property to the main highway. That road wasn't just access, it was crafted with intention, curving through the most beautiful parts of the land so visitors could appreciate the towering oaks and seasonal wildflowers before reaching the house. When Grandpa passed away last December, I inherited everything. At first, I planned to sell it. I had a demanding job in Riverside, an hour away, and couldn't imagine maintaining such a large property. But something kept me from listing it right away. Some unexplainable connection to the place where I'd spent countless summers as a kid. I visited Hillcrest infrequently those first few months, just enough to keep the yard from becoming completely overgrown and to air out the house occasionally. Then one Sunday in May, I drove up to find 6 cars parked along my private road. Confused, I continued to the house, assuming they belonged to hikers who had wandered onto the property by mistake. But when I returned a week later, there were 12 vehicles. This time I left notes on each windshield. This is private property, not a public parking area. Please do not park here again. I thought that would resolve things. I was wrong. My phone rang at 7:30 the following Saturday morning. "Mike, it's Mr. Jenkins from next door. You better get over here quick, son. There's something you need to see." Mr. Jenkins had been my grandfather's neighbor and friend for over 30 years. He wasn't one to exaggerate, so the urgency in his voice concerned me. "What's happening?" I asked, already grabbing my car keys. "That development behind us, Oakwood Estates, they've put up signs along your road. Big fancy ones saying Oakwood Estates overflow parking. There's at least 20 cars there now, and they're having some kind of landscaping crew put down gravel on the shoulders to expand the parking area." I broke every speed limit on the hour-long drive to Hillcrest. When I arrived, my jaw dropped. Both sides of my private road were lined with vehicles, luxury SUVs, sports cars, sedans, and a team of workers was indeed spreading gravel along the edges, widening the parking area. A large professional sign stood at the entrance. Oakwood Estates Resident Overflow Parking, authorized vehicles only. I parked behind a gravel truck blocking it and approached the workers. Who authorized this work? The foreman, a burly man with a clipboard, barely glanced at me. "Oakwood Estates HOA. We've got all the proper approvals." "That's impossible. This is my private road on my private property." Now he looked up, annoyance crossing his face. "Look, buddy, I just go where they tell me. Take it up with the homeowners association if you've got a problem." At that moment, a sleek white Range Rover pulled up, and a woman with highlighted blonde hair and oversized sunglasses stepped out. She wore white linen pants and a pastel blue blouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her movements were precise, confident, someone used to getting exactly what she wanted. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, not bothering to remove her sunglasses. "Yes, there's a problem. You're trespassing and making unauthorized modifications to my private property." She lowered her sunglasses slightly, looking me up and down like I was something unpleasant, stuck to her shoe. "And you are?" "Michael Cooper." I own Hillcrest Estate, including this road. A practiced smile spread across her face, not reaching her eyes. Karen Whitfield, Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association President. I think there's been a misunderstanding. This access road is now part of our community infrastructure. The previous landowner granted an easement for resident use. My grandfather never would have done that, and I inherited this property directly from him. Karen's smile didn't waver. Well, the documentation says otherwise. We have an official easement on file with the county. Now, if you'll excuse me, we need to finish this improvement project before our community barbecue this afternoon. She turned to walk away, clearly considering the conversation over. Wait, I called after her. I want to see this supposed easement. She sighed dramatically, retrieving a folder from her car. Here's a copy. As you can see, it was properly filed and recorded. Now, I have a very busy schedule, so unless there's something else... The document looked official enough, with a signature that vaguely resembled my grandfather's, but something felt wrong. The date on the easement was from just 3 months ago, when Grandpa was already gone. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was fraud. This signature is forged, I said, my voice tight with anger. My grandfather passed away in December. He couldn't have signed this in February. For a split second, surprise flashed across Karen's face before her composed mask returned. Our legal team handled all the paperwork. If there's a discrepancy, I'm sure it's just an administrative error. Feel free to contact our attorneys. She handed me a business card and walked away, already speaking into her phone. I stayed rooted to the spot, watching as the workers continued spreading gravel along my road, transforming it into a parking lot for people who had nothing to do with my family or our property. The vehicles belonged to the nearby Oakwood Estates, a new luxury development that had sprung up in the last few years on land adjacent to the far side of our property. Apparently, their 2-car garages and visitor parking weren't sufficient for their lifestyle needs. Mr. Jenkins approached, shaking his head. Your grandfather warned me this might happen. Those Oakwood people have been eyeing this road for years. Their development only has one entrance off the main highway, and it gets congested. They wanted your grandfather to sell them an easement for a second access point, but he always refused. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I asked. Didn't think it was necessary. Howard, your grandfather, said he'd taken care of it, made sure the property was protected. He didn't go into details, just said that if anyone ever tried to claim rights to any part of Hillcrest, I should tell you to look in the red box in his study. I thanked Mr. Jenkins and headed straight to the house. Grandpa's study remained exactly as he'd left it, books lining the walls, his ancient desk chair with the worn leather seat, fishing trophies displayed proudly on the shelves. I'd avoided this room during my visits, not yet ready to confront the memories it held. Now I searched desperately for a red box. It wasn't on the desk or the shelves, not in the drawers or the closet. I was about to give up when I noticed the edge of something red peeking out from behind the old law books on the bottom shelf. There it was, a simple red metal box, locked, with no key in sight. I searched the obvious places, desk drawers, nearby books, even checked if the key was taped under the desk. Nothing. Then I remembered how Grandpa loved fishing. I walked to the trophy on the largest bass he'd ever caught and turned it over. Taped to the bottom was a small key. Inside the box, I found a collection of documents carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The original deed to Hillcrest Estate, surveys from the 1960s and an updated one from 2010, property tax records, and a detailed map of the boundaries. There was also a thumb drive and a letter addressed to me in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Dear Mike, it began, if you're reading this, then someone's trying to take what doesn't belong to them. I've been fighting off the Oakwood developers for years. First, they wanted to buy the whole property. When I refused, they tried to claim my road was a historic public access path. Each time, I shut them down with the documents in this box. But they're persistent, and I worry they'll try again after I'm gone. Everything you need to protect Hillcrest is here. Original surveys, legal correspondence, and recorded conversations. Don't let them bully you, son. The truth is your strongest weapon. I plugged the thumb drive into my laptop. It contained folders of emails, recorded phone conversations, and videos of previous confrontations between my grandfather and various Oakwood representatives, including Karen Whitfield. In one video from just 6 months ago, she stood in this very study trying to convince my clearly ill grandfather to sign easement papers. His refusal was firm and clear. Armed with this evidence, I called Sarah Diaz, an attorney friend from college who specialized in property law. She arrived the next morning, reviewed everything, and her expression grew increasingly serious. "This is textbook fraud," she said, examining the forged easement. "They've falsified your grandfather's signature on a legal document months after his death. That's criminal." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And based on these recordings, they've been planning this for some time. "What can we do?" I asked. "First, we file for an emergency injunction to stop any further modifications to your property. Then we submit a formal complaint with evidence of the forgery." Sarah glanced out the window at the now full parking area, but judging by how quickly they moved on this, they're not expecting any resistance. "Did your grandfather mention anything else that might help us?" I shook my head, still processing the scope of the deception. How many people were involved? How had they gotten away with filing a clearly fraudulent document with the county? "I'll need to make some calls," Sarah said. "In the meantime, document everything. Take photos of the vehicles, the work they're doing, and any further interactions with the HOA. And Mike, be careful. People willing to commit fraud like this usually have other ethics lines they're comfortable crossing." Done. After Sarah left, I drove into town and purchased a high-definition security camera system, installing cameras covering the entire length of the road. Then I sat down at Grandpa's desk and began researching the Oakwood Estates HOA. Their website showcased an idyllic community of million-dollar homes with manicured lawns and an impressive clubhouse. The HOA board consisted of Karen Whitfield, president, Timothy Grant, treasurer, and 3 other residents. Karen's bio mentioned she was a former real estate developer and the wife of Richard Whitfield, who, a quick internet search revealed, was a county commissioner. The pieces were falling into place. With connections at the county office, filing a fraudulent easement would be relatively simple. No wonder Karen had seemed so confident. My phone rang, Sarah with an update. "I've filed the emergency injunction. The judge granted it immediately, given the evidence of fraud. No more construction activity is permitted on your road until this is resolved. I've also spoken with the sheriff's department, and they're sending someone out to enforce the order." That afternoon, a deputy arrived and posted official notices along the road. I stood nearby, watching as several Oakwood residents returned to their vehicles and noticed the signs. Their confusion turned to annoyance when they read that they were parking illegally on private property. A few took photos of the notices with their phones, likely sending them to Karen. I didn't have to wait long for her response. Her Range Rover screeched to a halt inches from where I stood. She emerged, waving a copy of the injunction. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "You can't just unilaterally revoke a legal easement." "I didn't revoke anything because no legal easement exists," I replied calmly. "The document you showed me contains my grandfather's forged signature, dated 3 months after his death. That's fraud, Karen, criminal fraud." Her composure cracked slightly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. My husband is County Commissioner Richard Whitfield. Yes, I know. I wonder how he'll feel about being connected to a criminal conspiracy. Karen's face flushed red. This is absurd. We have dozens of residents who rely on this parking area. You're creating a hardship for an entire community out of spite. I'm protecting what's legally mine. Your residents need to move their vehicles by 5 p.m. today. After that, any remaining cars will be considered abandoned on private property and towed at the owner's expense. You wouldn't dare. Try me. As she stormed back to her car, I noticed Mr. Jenkins watching from his property line, giving me a subtle thumbs up. This battle was just beginning, but for the first time since discovering the parking lot scheme, I felt a sense of control. By 4:30 p.m., not a single vehicle had been moved. At 5:15, I called the towing company I had on standby. As the first tow truck turned onto my road, Karen reappeared with 2 police officers. Officers, this man is threatening to illegally tow vehicles from a community-authorized parking area, she announced. The older officer sighed, clearly used to neighborhood disputes. Ma'am, we've reviewed the situation. There's a valid court injunction in place. If there are disputes about property lines or easements, that's a civil matter. But right now, these vehicles are on private property without the owner's permission, but the easement is being questioned in court, the officer interrupted. Until that's resolved, the injunction stands. Karen's face contorted with fury. She pulled out her phone and walked away, furiously tapping at the screen. Within minutes, residents began arriving to move their vehicles, casting angry glances in my direction as they drove away. That evening, I received a text message from an unknown number. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started. I forwarded it to Sarah, who advised documenting everything but not responding. The next morning, I woke to find the Pine Ridge Gazette on my doorstep with a front-page headline, "Local Man Claims Oakwood Estates. HOA forged documents to steal private road." Beside it was a photo of me standing next to the injunction notice. I hadn't spoken to any reporters. Someone else wanted this story public. My phone rang. It was Valerie Chen from the Gazette. "Mr. Cooper, I'd like to follow up on some information we received about the Oakwood Estates situation. Do you have time for a few questions?" "I didn't contact your paper," I said, confused. "No, we received an anonymous tip, along with copies, of what appear to be emails between Karen Whitfield and several county officials discussing how to acquire your road without purchasing it. The tipster suggested we speak with you for confirmation." I agreed to meet Valerie at the Pine Ridge Diner. When I arrived, she already had coffee waiting and a folder of documents spread across the table. The emails were damning. Karen had explicitly discussed using her husband's position to push through a backdated easement, mentioning that the old man's death makes this the perfect opportunity. "Do you know who sent these?" I asked. Valerie shook her head. "Anonymous source, but they're genuine. I verified the email headers and confirmed with a second source at the county office who wishes to remain anonymous. As we discussed the implications, the bell above the diner door jangled. Timothy Grant, the Oakwood Estates HOA treasurer, walked in, spotted us, and approached our table. "Mr. Cooper, I was hoping to find you. May I join you?" Timothy slid into the booth beside Valerie, looking nervously over his shoulder. He was a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a neatly trimmed gray beard, not at all what I'd expected from Karen's inner circle. "I've been the treasurer for Oakwood Estates for 3 years, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to be involved in anything illegal. When Karen first proposed the overflow parking solution, she told us all that the easement was legitimate, that your grandfather had agreed to it shortly before his passing. But he didn't," I said firmly. "I know that now." Timothy pulled a flash drive from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table. "Last night, after the injunction was posted, Karen called an emergency board meeting. She told us we needed to close ranks, and that anyone who couldn't support the community should resign immediately. When I questioned the validity of the easement, she threatened to reveal certain financial difficulties my family experienced last year. Valerie leaned forward, reporter instincts clearly engaged. She blackmailed you? Timothy nodded. All of us in different ways. Karen knows something compromising about every board member. It's how she maintains control. He tapped the flash drive. These are the HOA's financial records for the past 3 years. You'll find numerous irregularities, special assessments that never went toward their stated purpose, inflated vendor contracts with kickbacks, reserve funds diverted to Karen's personal projects. I pushed the drive toward Valerie. You should look into this. She picked it up carefully. Mr. Grant, are you willing to go on record with these allegations? His hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses to clean them. Yes, I'm tired of being afraid of her. What she's doing isn't just unethical, it's criminal. For the next hour, Timothy detailed how Karen had systematically taken control of Oakwood Estates, replacing board members who opposed her with personal allies, changing bylaws to consolidate her power, and using HOA funds like her personal bank account. Most residents remained unaware, blindly paying their increasing dues and assessments. The parking situation is worse than you realize, Timothy continued. Many homeowners don't even know about the easement. Karen told them the overflow parking was part of a new amenity included in their monthly fees. Some are paying extra for premium spots closest to the entrance. She's charging them to park on my property. I was incredulous. $175 per month for guaranteed spots. It's all in the financial records. After Timothy left, Valerie turned to me, eyes bright with journalistic fervor. This is bigger than property fraud, if even half of what he's saying is true, Karen. Whitfield has been running a years-long scheme to defraud an entire community. What's your next step? I asked. Research, verification, more interviews. A story this explosive requires absolute certainty. She gathered her notes. But first, I'm curious about something. How did you know to install cameras on your property so quickly? Most people wouldn't think of that right away. I hadn't told anyone about Grandpa's letter or the red box. Let's just say my grandfather taught me to be prepared. Returning to Hillcrest that afternoon, I found 3 Oakwood residents waiting by my front porch. A woman with curly red hair stepped forward. Mr. Cooper, I'm Elaine Winters. This is David Chen and Marcus Johnson. We live in Oakwood Estates and, well, we'd like to talk about the road situation. Cautiously, I invited them inside. Over coffee, they explained that many residents were growing frustrated with Karen's leadership. Monthly dues had increased 3 times in the past year. Rules were enforced arbitrarily. Anyone who questioned decisions faced immediate retaliation, surprise. Violations of obscure bylaws resulting in hefty fines. When we bought our home, the HOA seemed reasonable, David explained. The dues were moderate, the rules clear. Then Karen became president, and everything changed. We've tried voting her out, Marcus added. But she always wins by exactly the same margin, regardless of turnout. Some of us suspect the elections aren't entirely legitimate. What do you want from me? I asked. Elaine leaned forward. Information for now. We're organizing other homeowners who are tired of Karen's tactics. If what you're saying about the easement is true, and we believe it is, then we need to know exactly what other deceptions she's been involved in. This was an unexpected development. I hadn't considered that Karen might have enemies within her own community. I'll share what I can, I promised, but you should know that taking on Karen won't be easy. She has connections, and she's not afraid to use them. We know the risks, Elaine said firmly. But this parking issue might be exactly what we need. Concrete evidence of fraud that even her supporters can't ignore. As they left, I felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just my fight anymore. That evening, despite the injunction, 3 cars parked on my road. The security cameras captured their drivers. Karen herself, her husband Richard, and another man I didn't recognize. They stood in the middle of my property, gesturing as if planning something. I saved the footage and sent it to Sarah. Her response came quickly. "They're testing you. Don't engage directly. Document everything." The next morning, I woke to find yellow construction tape marking a straight line from the main highway directly through my property to the Oakwood Estates entrance. Much shorter route than the current access road they used. Workers in bright vests were taking measurements and marking the ground. I approached the crew supervisor. "What's happening here?" "Surveying for the new Oakwood Connector Road," he replied casually. "County approved it yesterday. Eminent domain. For public safety, apparently the current access road has dangerous visibility issues." I immediately called Sarah, who was as shocked as I was. "They can't just push through eminent domain overnight. This has to be Richard Whitfield using his position as commissioner. I'll file another emergency motion." While waiting for Sarah to take action, I did something probably unwise. I drove directly to the Whitfield residence in Oakwood Estates. Their house was the largest in the community, with perfectly manicured landscaping and a 3-car garage. Karen's Range Rover sat in the circular driveway. She answered the door in designer athleisure wear, her smile freezing when she saw me. "Mr. Cooper, this is unexpected." "Eminent domain? Really?" I didn't bother hiding my anger. Creating a fraudulent easement wasn't enough. "So now you're using your husband's position to steal my land." Karen stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind her. "Lower your voice. This isn't about you anymore. The county needs a secondary emergency access road to Oakwood Estates. Your property happens to be in the way. We both know that's a lie. You tried to steal my road through fraud, and when that failed, you moved to Plan B." Her expression hardened. "Listen carefully. You will lose this battle. Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. Richard sits on 6 county boards. We have friends in every department that matters. The judge who'll hear your case, his daughter got her first job at Richard's company. The sheriff, his annual fundraiser is held at our country club. So you're openly admitting to corruption." Karen laughed, a cold, dismissive sound. "I'm explaining reality. People like you think following rules matters. People like us know the rules are just for show." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll drop your objections to the easement. In exchange, the county will pay fair market value for the land needed for the connector road. Refuse, and we'll take it anyway through eminent domain, but the process will be so tied up in court that you'll spend more on legal fees than the land is worth." "You're assuming I care about the money." Something dangerous flashed in her eyes. "Everyone has a price, Mr. Cooper, or a breaking point. Find his," she'd said to her husband, not realizing I could still hear as she closed the door. Driving back to Hillcrest, my mind raced. Karen was right about one thing: they had connections everywhere. Fighting them through normal channels might be impossible. But maybe that wasn't the only way. I called Sarah. "I need to know exactly where my property lines are, down to the inch, and I need to understand what rights I have on my own land." "Planning something?" she asked cautiously, just exploring all my options. After speaking with Sarah, I made 2 more calls, one to a security company, the other to a contractor who had worked with my grandfather years ago. Within hours, both had representatives at Hillcrest, walking the property with me as I outlined what I needed. "Can this be done by tomorrow morning?" I asked the contractor. He whistled. "Rush job, extra crew, overnight work. We'll need special equipment. It'll cost you. Price doesn't matter. What matters is that it's done right and done quickly." While the crews mobilized, I received a text from Timothy Grant. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow evening. Karen telling everyone you've rejected reasonable compromise. Residents angry. Perfect timing. At dawn, I surveyed the work. The contractor had exceeded my expectations. Where my private road met the public highway, a heavy steel gate now stood, connected to sturdy fencing that extended 20 feet in both directions. The gate itself had an electronic keypad and intercom system with a large sign reading, "Private property, authorized access only. All others will be towed." The security company had installed additional cameras covering every angle of the entrance, with motion sensors and automated warnings. The entire system was controlled by an app on my phone. Now came the waiting game. Around 7:30 a.m., the first Oakwood residents arrived, expecting to use their parking area. They found the gate closed and locked. Some turned around immediately, but others got out of their cars, examining the gate and calling someone, Karen, presumably. By 8:15, vehicles had queued up along the highway shoulder. At 8:30, Karen's Range Rover appeared. She stormed up to the gate, pressed the intercom button, and demanded entry. I answered from the comfort of Grandpa's study, watching her on the security feed. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield. This is private property. Access is restricted to authorized individuals only. Open this gate immediately. You can't block access to our community parking area. There is no community parking area on my property. The fraudulent easement has been reported to authorities, and the court injunction remains in effect." Karen's face contorted with rage. "You listen to me. People need to get to work. There are children who need to get to school. You're creating a dangerous situation. I'm simply securing my private property against trespassers. Oakwood Estates has its own access road off the highway. I suggest your residents use that. Our overflow parking is not on my land," I finished firmly. "Have a nice day, Mrs. Whitfield." I disconnected, but continued watching as she tried the intercom repeatedly, then attempted to scale the fence before giving up. She returned to her vehicle and made several phone calls, gesturing angrily. Within 30 minutes, a police cruiser arrived. Chief Rodriguez himself stepped out, speaking briefly with Karen before approaching the gate. I answered his intercom call. "Mr. Cooper, this is Chief Rodriguez. We have a situation developing here." "Good morning, Chief. I'm watching on my security system. Is there a problem?" "Mrs. Whitfield claims you've illegally blocked access to a community easement. The easement she's referring to has been proven fraudulent. It contains my grandfather's forged signature dated months after his death. My attorney filed an emergency injunction, which was granted. I'm simply securing my private property against trespassers." The chief nodded slowly. "I'm aware of the injunction. However, we have concerns about the vehicles currently stranded on your property." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Stranded vehicles on my property. Yes, apparently numerous Oakwood residents left their vehicles in what they believed was a designated parking area. Now they can't access them. "Due to your gate." I feigned surprise. "That's concerning. I posted notices about the injunction and the private property status. Anyone parking there after those notices was trespassing. However, I'm not unreasonable. I'll be happy to grant temporary access so they can remove their vehicles." "That would be appreciated. Of course, I'll need to verify that only legitimate vehicle owners enter, and they'll need to remove their cars immediately. No new vehicles should enter." The chief agreed, and I remotely opened the gate, watching carefully as residents hurried to their cars. Karen stood by her Range Rover, glaring at each person who drove past. By 10 a.m., all the vehicles had cleared out, except for 23 cars parked farther down my road, beyond the bend and out of sight from the entrance. When all the owners had left, I closed the gate again. Karen immediately pressed the intercom. There are still vehicles on your property. You need to allow owners to retrieve them. All the owners who came forward have retrieved their vehicles, I replied innocently. If there are others, they'll need to contact me directly with proof of ownership. You know perfectly well there are more cars down the road. You're doing this deliberately. Mrs. Whitfield, I've cooperated fully with Chief Rodriguez. If there are additional vehicle owners, they're welcome to follow the same process. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Throughout the day, a steady stream of frustrated Oakwood residents arrived at the gate, each going through the verification process before being allowed in to retrieve their cars. Karen remained by her vehicle for hours, becoming increasingly agitated as she realized what was happening. I was controlling the narrative, demonstrating reasonableness while highlighting the inconvenience her actions had caused her own community members. By late afternoon, all but 7 vehicles had been claimed. These remaining cars belonged to board members and Karen's closest allies, the ones most involved in the fraudulent scheme. They would have to publicly identify themselves as co-conspirators to retrieve their vehicles. Timothy texted updates from inside Oakwood. Residents furious about parking situation, blaming Karen for not disclosing risks. Emergency meeting attendance expected to be record-breaking. At 7 p.m., I drove to Oakwood Estates, parking around the corner from the clubhouse where the meeting was being held. Timothy had left a side door unlocked, allowing me to slip in unnoticed as Karen addressed the packed room. "This is clearly a vindictive action by Mr. Cooper," she was saying, her voice strained. "He's holding our community hostage because he refuses to honor his grandfather's commitment." A man in the front row stood up. "But was there actually a commitment? We've heard the easement might be fraudulent." "That's absurd," Karen snapped. "The easement is perfectly legal. Then why did a judge grant an emergency injunction?" someone else called out. "And why are you charging us $175 a month for parking spots on land that might not even belong?" "To the HOA," added a woman near the back. Karen's composure was cracking. "These are complex legal matters that are being addressed. My car was trapped on his property all day," shouted another resident. "I had to miss an important client meeting." The mood in the room was turning hostile, not toward me, but toward Karen. I decided it was time to make my presence known. I stepped out from the shadows and walked calmly to the front of the room. "Good evening," I said. The room fell silent. "I'm Michael Cooper, owner of Hillcrest Estate. I believe there's been some confusion about what's been happening, and I'd like to clear it up." Karen's face drained of color. "This is a private HOA meeting. You need to leave immediately." "Actually," Timothy interjected, rising from his seat at the board table, "as treasurer, I invited Mr. Cooper to provide information directly relevant to tonight's agenda. Our bylaws allow for guest speakers with board approval." Before Karen could object, I addressed the crowd. "I never wanted to be in conflict with any of you. The simple truth is that the easement Mrs. Whitfield has been referencing contains my grandfather's forged signature, dated 3 months after his death. I have proof of this fraud, which I've submitted to the authorities. I projected images from my phone onto the meeting room screen. The fraudulent document, my grandfather's death certificate with the date clearly visible, and a still from the security footage showing Karen, Richard, and county officials on my property after the injunction was issued. Additionally, I've discovered that many of you have been charged monthly fees for parking spots on my land, spots that were never legally available in the first place." The room erupted in angry shouts directed at Karen. She attempted to regain control, but Timothy stepped forward with his own bombshell. "As treasurer, I feel obligated to inform all members that these parking fees, totaling over $87,000 in the past year, weren't used for community improvements as claimed in our financial reports." They were diverted to a separate account controlled solely by President Whitfield. This revelation sent the room into chaos. In the midst of the uproar, Elaine Winters called for an immediate vote of no confidence in the board leadership. Timothy, he quickly seconded the motion, citing emergency provisions in the bylaws. Karen, seeing her control slipping away, made a desperate attempt to adjourn the meeting. When that failed, she resorted to threats. Anyone voting against this board will face immediate fine reviews and compliance inspections. Her threat backfired spectacularly. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor of removing Karen and her allies from the board. Timothy was named interim president until proper elections could be held. As the meeting concluded, residents approached me with apologies and questions. Many had been unaware of the situation's full scope, believing Karen's version of events. Without question, some expressed genuine remorse about the inconvenience and stress they'd unwittingly caused. Karen and Richard slipped out a side door during the commotion, but not before Richard glared at me with undisguised hatred. I knew this wasn't over. They still had powerful connections and plenty to lose if the full extent of their schemes became public. The following morning, Valerie Chen's exposé appeared in the Pine Ridge Gazette. HOA fraud scheme exposed, county officials implicated. The article detailed not only the fraudulent easement, but also numerous other improprieties involving the Whitfields and county resources. By afternoon, the district attorney's office announced an investigation into Richard Whitfield's actions as commissioner. The eminent domain proceedings for the Connector Road were immediately suspended pending review. That evening, as I sat on Grandpa's porch, watching the sunset over the property he'd loved so dearly, Timothy called with news. Karen and Richard packed up and left town this morning. Rumor has it they're headed for their vacation home in Florida ahead of the investigation. I felt an unexpected sense of emptiness. The battle had consumed me for weeks. Now that it was ending, I wasn't sure what came next. I'd never planned to stay at Hillcrest permanently, yet something had shifted during this ordeal. The connection I felt to this place, to my grandfather's legacy, had deepened. 2 days later, a formal letter arrived from the new Oakwood Estates board requesting a meeting to discuss mutually beneficial arrangements regarding access to my road. I agreed to hear them out. Timothy, Elaine, and 3 other new board members came to Hillcrest with a straightforward proposal. They wanted to lease, not take, a small portion of my road for legitimate overflow parking with proper legal documentation and fair market compensation. Additionally, they offered to establish a conservation easement for the wooded areas between our properties, ensuring they would remain undeveloped in perpetuity. "We want to be good neighbors," Elaine explained, "not entitled trespassers." As we finalized the details over the following weeks, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would renovate the old farmhouse and make Hillcrest my permanent home. My city apartment felt hollow compared to the sense of purpose and connection I'd found here. The gate remains, but now it bears a different sign. Hillcrest and Oakwood Estates, shared access, resident keys only. It stands as a reminder that boundaries matter, but so does community, built on honesty, respect, and mutual benefit. The final piece fell into place a month later when I discovered a hidden compartment in Grandpa's desk containing a journal. In it, he had documented every interaction with the Whitfields over the years, including a crucial entry from just weeks before his death. "They'll try again after I'm gone. Probably a forged easement. It's their usual tactic." Left everything. Mike needs in the red box. The real trap isn't the evidence, though. It's giving them enough rope to hang themselves with their own greed. My grandfather hadn't just left me tools to fight back. He'd anticipated exactly how they would attack and designed a scenario where their own entitlement would become their undoing. The perfect trap wasn't the gate that stranded their vehicles, or the evidence that exposed their fraud. It was allowing Karen's arrogance and assumptions to operate unchecked until she'd created a situation so untenable that her own community turned against her. I closed the journal smiling. "Well played, Grandpa," I whispered to the empty study. "Well played indeed." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.